When I was told my daughter had passed away, I knew it wasn't true. The truth would come out and justice would be served. Having always wanted a daughter, I felt incredibly happy to hear the first cry of my newborn baby, but that joy quickly faded when I was told that my daughter had passed away. But I sensed that something was amiss. In my heart, I was convinced it was a lie. But one thing I know for sure is that we will fight for justice until the end. I've always dreamed of having a daughter. It probably sounds a little strange, but I had a feeling that I was going to have a girl. Maybe because my mom was the only daughter in the family, or maybe just because I wanted to see my life that way. But fate had it differently. When I found out that I was pregnant, I was overjoyed. I immediately began to imagine what our little girl would be like, a little copy of me or my husband Ben. We chose names, discussed what toys we would buy and started planning the baby's room. Everything went perfectly until the day of delivery. It was the scariest day of my life. The labor was hard, but I made it through. When I finally heard the first cry of my baby girl, my heart literally froze with happiness. However, the joy did not last long. The doctors quickly took the baby away, saying that they had to do some procedures. I still didn't realize it when they came back to me with the terrible news that my daughter had died. I was struck by lightning. The world around me ceased to exist. How could this happen? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it before? The doctor's answers were vague and evasive. They spoke of some complication that could not be avoided. But I sensed that something was wrong. Deep down, I knew it wasn't true. Ben tried to comfort me, telling me that we could try again, that everything would be okay. But I couldn't believe him. First of all, I was left with this weird feeling that the doctors were hiding something. And second, I could hear the nurses talking outside the room. They mentioned some large sum of money and a rush of paperwork. It got me thinking. It was a month after the tragedy and I was still reeling. Ben offered to foster the baby. He thought it would help us deal with our grief. I resisted at first, but then I realized he was right. That's how little Jason came into our lives when he was 1.5 years. Jason was a wonderful boy. He quickly became a part of our family, and although the pain of loss never went away, taking care of him helped take my mind off of it. We moved to another town, away from the unpleasant memories. Time passed, and we gradually got used to the new life. But somewhere deep inside, I kept searching for answers to my questions. 13 years have passed. Jason is a smart and kind boy who loves his foster parents more than anything in the world. One day he told me that he was talking to a girl at school. Her name was Lisa. She was very nice and he wanted to invite her to visit us. I decided to invite Lisa to dinner to get to know her better. She seemed like a nice and polite girl, but there was something about her that made me troubling. And I realized that she was a lot like me as a child. She had the same eyes, the same smile, the same disposition. This resemblance was so amazing that I couldn't believe it. Could it be? The next day I decided to talk to Jason. I asked him if he knew anything about Lisa. He replied that she didn't tell me anything unusual, but said she was born in the same town as us. This coincidence seemed too strange to me. At night I couldn't sleep. I was tormented by the thought that Lisa could be my daughter. I remembered all those strange conversations in the maternity hospital, the money, the documents. What if the doctors really did something wrong, bad? What if they had given my daughter to someone else? I got Lisa's cell phone number from Jason. The next morning, I decided to call her mother. The phone call was short and tense. Lisa's mother refused to talk to me, claiming that her daughter was her blood, that she would forbid Lisa from being friends with Jason, and that I wouldn't bother them again. The conversation left me feeling empty and despair. Gradually, the disappointment was replaced by a sense of hopelessness. It seemed that all hope for justice was gone. I decided to go to the police. I told them the whole story, starting with the birth of my daughter and ending with my meeting with Lisa. The police listened to me carefully, but skeptically. They said that there are many such cases, and many people try to find a connection where there is none. The cops clearly didn't believe my words, and even when I showed them pictures of Lisa, they just shrugged their shoulders. But I continued to stand my ground. So, the police checked my documents, but found nothing suspicious and they couldn't take any further action. But something inside me wouldn't let me calm down. I knew I had to keep fighting. So, I decided to act on my own. I started collecting information of the doctors who worked at the hospital on that fateful day. I found out that some of them suddenly quit or moved to another city shortly after the incident. This seemed highly suspicious to me. I found out where one of the doctors lived. One day, when Ben was at work and Jason wasn't home from school yet, I decided to visit this doctor. His name was Dr. Williams, and he lived in the suburbs. So, I drove over to his house, and I knocked on his door. He opened the door and I immediately caught his displeasure. "Dr. Williams, I know you were involved in what happened to me at the maternity hospital," I said firmly. "You have to tell me the truth." He tried to close the door, but I held it open with my hand. "Please leave," he whispered. "You have no business being here." "No, I'm not leaving until I know the truth," I replied. "My daughter is alive, and I want her back." Dr. Williams looked at me with sadness and fear in his eyes. "I can't help you," he said. "If you keep digging into this case, you could be taken away. It's best to leave it alone." I was scared, but at the same time I felt a rush of adrenaline. So, I was right. Someone was really hiding the truth, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to do so. When I got home, I thought about Dr. Williams' words for a long time. It was clear that the case was much more serious than I had realized. There was a lot of money and a lot of power people. But I couldn't stop. I had to find out the truth at any cost. The next day I went to the police again. This time I brought with me all the evidence I had collected and asked to see the chief. I told him about the meeting with Dr. Williams and his threats. The supervisor listened to me carefully and promised to start an investigation. However, a week after our conversation, I received an unexpected call. It was the detective who was in charge of my case. "Mrs. Smith," he began, "I'm afraid I have some bad news. Your case is closed. We've found no evidence that your charges have merit." "How is that possible?" I exclaimed. "You promised to investigate." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Smith, but our hands are tied. We've received orders from on high to stop the investigation. I think you should leave this case and go back to your normal life." Those words sounded like a judgment. Everything I'd done over the last few months had been for nothing. But I wasn't going to give up. If the system wasn't working, then I had to work outside of it. I decided to find people who could help me get to the truth. I was willing to use any means necessary to find out the truth and get my daughter back. At night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep a wink. Ben slept beside me, but I couldn't share my thoughts with him. I was afraid that if I told him what I was going to do, he would try to stop me. But I had to act. The next morning, I called a private investigator who had been recommended to me by someone I knew. His name was Jack, and he had a reputation for finding things that others couldn't. We agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, Jack was already waiting for me. He was a tall, sturdy man with a stern look in his eyes. After a brief greeting, I got right down to business. "Jack," I began, "I need your help. I'm sure my daughter is alive, and that she's been illegally handed over to another family. The police refuse to help, so I have to turn to you." Jack listened intently without interrupting. When I finished, he thought for a moment, then asked, "Do you realize that this could be dangerous? People who do this sort of thing will stop at nothing to keep their secrets." "Yes, I understand," I answered firmly. "But I'm willing to take the risk. For my daughter's sake, I'll do whatever it takes." Jack nodded. "Good. Then let's get started. I need all the data you have, names of doctors, addresses, dates, any little things that might help in the investigation. I handed him a folder with the information I'd gathered. He looked through it carefully, making notes in his notebook. "That's a good start," he said. "Let's make a deal. I'll keep you informed of any developments. But remember, it may take some time. These cases are rarely resolved quickly." I agreed. When I got home, I tried to behave as usual, but I was impatient inside. Each day seemed like an eternity. Finally, after 2 weeks, Jack called. "I have some information," he said. "Meet me tonight at the same place." When I arrived at the cafe, Jack looked excited. "I found something interesting," he began. "It turns out that one of the nurses who worked at this maternity hospital recently retired and moved to another state. Her name is Emily. Rumor has it she was involved in a scheme to sell babies. I think she might know something important." "Where is she now?" I asked, barely able to contain my excitement. "In a small town upstate. I've already bought train tickets. We're going there tomorrow morning." The next day we hit the road. The trip took about 6 hours, and the whole time I couldn't think of anything else but the upcoming meeting. When we arrived, Jack rented a car and we headed to Emily's house. The house stood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick woods. When we got to the door, Jack stopped. "Wait here," he said. "Let her see only me. If she sees you, she might get scared and refuse to talk." I stayed outside, watching the house through the branches of the trees. A few minutes later the door opened and Jack stepped inside. It was about half an hour before he came back out. "She's agreed to talk to you," he reported. "But be careful. She's afraid of being found and taken out." I walked into the house. Emily appeared to be an elderly woman with a tired face. She was sitting in a chair, nervously rubbing her handkerchief. "Emily," I began, trying to speak calmly, "I know you were involved in what happened to me at the hospital. Please tell me what happened to my daughter." Emily looked at me with pity. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "They made me. Threatened me and my family. I had no choice." She took a deep breath and continued, "Your daughter was handed over to a couple. They paid a huge amount of money to get a healthy baby. I remember them naming her Lisa." My heart clenched. That name was familiar. Lisa. The same girl who came to our house with Jason. "Are you sure?" I asked in a shaky voice. "Yes, I'm absolutely sure," Emily said. "I remember her face. She was such a beautiful little girl." At that moment, I realized that I'd been right all along. Lisa really was my daughter. But how do I tell her that? How do I explain to Jason that his friend was his sister? Emily went on and on about how the scheme worked, who was involved, how much money changed hands. But I couldn't hear her anymore. My mind was preoccupied with one question: what to do next? When I got home, Ben met me at the door. He noticed right away that something was wrong with me. What was wrong? I sat down on the couch and told him everything. About meeting the nurse, about Lisa being our daughter. Ben was dumbfounded, but, as always, remained calm and rational. "We have to talk to Lisa," he said. "She needs to know the truth." But the problem was that Lisa was forbidden to talk to Jason or to come to our house at all. Lisa's parents were strictly enforcing that. We realized that the situation required extreme caution. Violating the ban could have serious consequences, including legal problems. Ben and I discussed our options, but each of them seemed risky. We didn't want to jeopardize our children, but we couldn't bear the thought of keeping Lisa in the dark. Now we faced a new challenge: how to proceed. We could not announce our discovery, because it could hurt everyone involved in the situation. But we couldn't leave things as they were. We decided to keep the secret temporarily, hoping that one day circumstances would allow us to reveal the truth publicly. Every morning, I wake up thinking that there are many challenges ahead. But I know one thing, we will fight for justice until the end. And even though the future is unknown, we will do everything we can to protect our family and get to the truth. The point is not yet made.